is Andy Foyce. I am the chairman of the Administrative Conference, and I want to welcome you to the inaugural meeting of the ACUS Roundtable on State and Local Administrative Procedures. I'm very happy and excited that we're getting started with this project, and I want to thank you all for your participation. Thanks all, a special thanks to Jeremy Greyboys and Alexandra Saibo for their work on getting this project off the ground. Justice Brandeis famously said some years ago that states are the laboratories of democracy. Although we seem to be more used to the federal government dictating to the states lately, there are lessons for federal agencies to learn from state administrative practices. That is the question that this roundtable will be addressing with its series of meetings. The ACUS Office of the Chair has convened them as part of its statutory mission to promote improvements in the efficiency, adequacy, and fairness of federal administrative procedures. We hope to, in these roundtables, identify promising state procedural practices and share them with federal agencies. And to that end, we will be active in this area, and we will periodically convene meetings on specific topics of interest to federal officials. Some of those topics may include the following: state agency processes for periodic retrospective review of regulations. And ACUS presently has a project that we're working on and that the plenary session will adopt in June, hopefully, on retrospective review using artificial or algorithmic tools. Another issue we may address are policies on ex parte communications and rulemaking, initiatives to expand representation of parties or assist self-represented parties in administrative adjudication. We have been working with the Legal Services Corporation for a while now through another roundtable addressing those issues. And we may also look at pioneering uses of technology to manage workloads, promote transparency, or enhance public participation, all of which are important issues and ongoing work for ACUS. To lead these sessions, we are very grateful to have such distinguished co-chairs and guests. The roundtable is co-chaired by ACUS public member Kate Todd and Professor Maria Pomomarenko. Sorry for that momentary brain fog on your name, Maria. Kate is a former deputy White House counsel and now is managing partner at Ellis, George, and Cipollone. She has taught at 2 law schools and clerked for both Justice Thomas and Judge Michael Luttig. Maria is professor at law at the University of Texas at Austin Law School with expertise and publications in several areas of the law, including local administrative agencies. She is co-founder of the Policing Project at NYU Law School and an associate reporter for an ongoing ALI project. We are also thrilled to have 3 experts with us today. The Honorable Judge Jeffrey Sutton, Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 6th Circuit, will provide opening remarks, and then Professor Ponomarenko will lead a panel discussion on innovations in state and local transparency practices and lessons for federal agencies. I will let her introduce the 2 panelists, but I just must say that one of them is much beloved at ACUS for his longtime service as our research director. So let me turn things over to Kate to introduce Judge Sutton, and thank you again.
Thank you, Andy, for the introduction and for your support, and along with the work of the dedicated staff at ACUS and your predecessor, Matt Weiner, in launching this roundtable project. I have the honor of kicking things off with a brief introduction of Chief Judge Jeffrey Sutton of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 6th Circuit. He is, the 6th Circuit encompasses, for those who don't know off the top of their heads, Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee. Before serving on this court for the last 2 decades, and I think celebrating recent anniversary along that score, Chief Judge Sutton clerked at the Second Circuit. He also clerked for Justices Powell and Scalia at the Supreme Court. He worked in private practice. He served as the Solicitor General of Ohio. He's taught in numerous settings as an adjunct professor, and he's on the Council of the American Law Institute. Highly relevant to today's discussion, Chief Judge Sutton has been really at the forefront of reigniting academic and prudential interest in a panoramic study of state law and institutions through the publication of his work on state constitutions called 51 Imperfect Solutions, and his more recent work, Who Decides States as Laboratories of Constitutional Experimentation. He's also the co-author of a textbook on state constitutions, among other works. Chief Judge Sutton clearly is very interested, and I think cares deeply about what the states are doing, and that it is an important field for study. He's already generously given his time behind the scenes on kind of giving us background thoughts for launching this particular project. And Maria and I are very thankful today that he's giving his time to help place state law in focus. So with that, Judge Sutton.
All right. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, ACUS. Thank you, Andy. I'm thrilled to be with you all. Good for you in shining a light on state administrative law procedures. I see my task today is looking at it from a high level, and I'll do some comparisons between the state and federal constitutions that implicate administrative law, and then start to drill down on some of the administrative law issues that arise from those differences in the two constitutions. I hope to take about 15 minutes. We'll see. Comparison, you know, our president, Teddy Roosevelt, called comparison the thief of happiness, and that assuredly is true if you're 13 years old. I'd like to think less true as we get older, and I know less true when we're comparing state and federal systems. As Andy pointed out, Brandeis correctly identified a virtue of federalism, that when we've got a difficult problem, I would call administrative law one that doesn't always yield clear answers. If you have a difficult problem, it's not a bad idea to allow, in our country's situation, 51 different approaches to the problem. For winning insight emerges, by all means, nationalize it, but that has not always been the case in administrative law. You know, it's well to remember what Brandeis said before the laboratories of experimentation point. He said, quote, "To stay experimentation in things social and economic is a grave responsibility. Denial of the right to experiment may be fraught with serious consequences to the nation." When it comes to administrative law and separation of powers, the states are really on their own. The US Constitution does guarantee a Republican form of government, but the Supreme Court has not found it to be judicially enforceable. And so the states really have quite a bit of flexibility in how they structure government, which translates to how they operate agencies. You know, it's not always been the case that national administrative law experts have been interested in the state experiences. The leading administrative law treatise, I think this is from the 50s, put the point this way, I'd say quite disparagingly, said the typical state court administrative law opinion, quote, "strings together some misleading legal cliches and announces the conclusion," end quote. Ouch. I can't say whether that was true in the 1950s, as administrative law was still early in its development, but I don't think it's remotely true today. And I think, as you'll see, many of the most interesting things going on in administrative law are actually occurring at the state level. So let me start with some constitutional distinctions between the federal and state constitutions, which I think are really worth bearing in mind, even when you get down to notice and comment rulemaking and the specifics of administrative law. I think it's quite helpful to appreciate some of these differences, because they might well affect why federal administrative law could work differently from state administrative law, and other times suggest that the comparisons are still quite valuable. So at the federal level, separation of powers famously is implied. There's no separation of powers clause in the US Constitution. The Constitution simply implies it by separating the executive power, the legislative power into Article 1, 2, and then Article 3 for the judicial power. So the idea of separation of powers is implied by the reality that they're each put in separate branches and identified as the, say, legislative power. That's not how it works at the state level. It's worth bearing in mind that separation of powers actually originates in the states. The first constitutions in the world that experimented with separation of powers were the early state constitutions, which started getting drafted in 1775. And many of them, of course, would have predated the federal constitution in 1789. So they all had separation of powers in it. They separated it in Articles 1, 2, and 3. Federal Constitution, of course, followed that. But they did something in addition, and most of them have express separation of powers clauses. So, for example, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 says, I'm quoting, "In the government of this Commonwealth, the legislative department shall never exercise the executive power or judicial powers, or either of them. The executive shall never exercise the legislative and judicial powers or either of them," and so on. A lot of states have that exact language. The Virginia Constitution of 1776 uses a different formulation, but it too is an express separation of powers clause. It says, quote, "The legislative and executive powers of the state should be separate and distinct from the judicative." Today, 40 state constitutions have express separation of powers clauses. You might be interested to know that one state actually contemplates agencies. The original constitutions did not. The Connecticut Constitution expressly contemplates and permits executive branch agencies. So that's one high-level difference, is the state constitutions really take state separation of powers seriously. The second high-level difference, which affects all of administrative law, is the way the executive branch operates the federal system and how that contrasts with the state system. At the federal level, we famously have the unitary executive, and say for independent agencies, every agency head reports to the president, appointed by the president, fireable by the president. So there's no separate election for an AG, the head of HHS, or the EPA. Just 3 states stand by the federal model, Maine, New Hampshire, and New Jersey. Everyone else has some form of what I'll call plural executive, separate elections for more than just a governor. A good example would be attorneys general. 43 states separately elect their attorneys general. 48 states, the attorney general is separate from the governor. In other words, some of those AGs may be, say, appointed by the Supreme Court, as in Tennessee, so their power is independent of the governor. It's just 2 states in which the governor controls the actions of the AGs. And this continues on. There's 37 Secretary of States that are separately elected, 34 treasurers, and so forth. Well, when we get to talking about agency deference and how that works, you'll be able to see pretty quickly why the plural executive really has an impact on state administrative law. A third area of difference, federal judges are life tenured, no age limits. Once you get through the confirmation process, that's that, short of a felony and impeachment. At the state levels, 90% of state court judges are elected. Only Rhode Island has a life tenure, no age limit model. So the election of state court judges is going to make a difference. Another constitutional difference, the state constitutions are a lot easier to amend. And consistent with that reality, they've become more and more democratic over time. Miriam Seifter and Jessica Bulletin-Posen refer to it as the democracy principle. And I think they're really onto something, that our state governments are much more hyper-democratic. And I think that shows up in administrative law as well. So let's just talk about how some of these differences might affect some areas of state administrative law. So one area of debate at the federal level right now is, the concept of delegation and whether there's a limit on how much the legislature, Congress, can delegate to an agency when it comes to a particular policy area. By and large, the non-delegation doctrine is a non-existent doctrine at the federal level. It's just been enforced 2 times, all in the fertile year of 1935. The states, by contrast, quite regularly enforce it. By one scholarly account, 43 states regularly enforce non-delegation principles. And that what that ultimately means is that legislatures at the state level tend to be a little more careful in establishing guardrails for whatever an agency is going to do in a given policy area. I can't say the state language or tests for enforcement of non-delegation principles has yielded a eureka moment, but if you focus on what they're doing as opposed to what they're saying, they clearly are taking non-delegation seriously, and I guess I would say separation of powers seriously at the state level. Deference to administrative agencies, the Chevron concept. We all know the federal story. We all know the federal debates, some of the limits on Chevron, and God only knows its future. The state stories are fascinating. Some states have taken care of this by through their constitution, by barring administrative deference under either interpretations of the state constitution or express language in the state constitution. Remarkably, one state eliminated deference to administrative agencies through a constitutional initiative. Florida in 2018 eliminated any deference to agencies at the state level by a 62% vote. I must say, I'm astonished that 62% of Floridians even knew what agency deference was, but good for them. Some have barred deference by statute, which a legislature surely could do. What it could create, it could limit in its creation. And states like Arizona and Wisconsin have eliminated any agency deference by statute. And then, of course, some, and I would say the vast majority at the state level, have limited agency deference through court decisions. If you were to generalize with the states that have any deference at all, it would be a form really of Skidmore type deference. Really only 12 states out of our 50 have some form of deference where it goes beyond Skidmore. So why the differences? Why is this going on, and what might explain it? Well, as pointed out, separation of powers is front and center in the state constitutions. It would make sense that might affect how state court judges and even elected officials would deal with these doctrines. I have no doubt that the plural executive, the separate election of state AGs, secretaries of state, treasurers, auditors, and so on, would have an impact on agency deference. It prompts the question, to whom do you defer? Just take AGs and governors. The AG is the top legal official, the governor arguably the top policy official. Who gets deference in a world in which they disagree, say a Democratic AG, a Republican governor? So it would make sense that the plural executive would implicate and ultimately, in some cases, alter how deference looks. No doubt the election of 90% of state judges is making a difference. You can imagine an elected judge saying, why would I defer to another elected official? It's possible the democracy principle is just another way of putting that point. One strange feature of the differences between administrative law at the federal level and the state level is that we have a situation where the legislature gets the most authority with broad delegations at the federal level. We still have deference to those agencies at the federal level, and yet it's the federal agencies that have the most power because their jurisdiction is nationwide. If you're an interest group and you pay attention to incentives, you can understand why this is a good system for an interest group. You'd much rather have one rule through one agency, even if it's a rule you don't love, but it's a rule you can live with because it's one rule, it's nationwide. And best of all, it end runs, circumvents some of the stickier procedural limitations at the state level, whether it's absence of deference or more non-delegation enforcement. One of the things that's fun about comparison, it's not just state to state, it's state to federal. And one reason the US Supreme Court to date has been reluctant to enforce non-delegation principles, reluctant to eliminate deference to agencies, has been kind of a sky is falling phenomenon. What would happen without these doctrines, or what would happen with enforcement of, say, non-delegation? And, if nothing else, the state experiences show that that may not be a salient concern. There may be other reasons to stick with the status quo, but that probably isn't one of them. One other, I would call this a parallel. This is one where the state and federal administrative law doctrines align. I would say there's a real sensitivity to cases with criminal law implications. So you saw this in the federal Gundy case, and there's just lots and lots of state cases where when the courts are unwilling to defer to an agency, more willing to enforce non-delegation, it's often when the case involves a criminal law consequence or principle. This potentially, and if you ask for a prediction, is an area where I expect to see more development. You have a lot of statutes that start out as civil. They establish a standard of care, and then the legislature says if you violate the standard of care, it not only has civil penalty or remedy consequences, but then would have criminal consequences. So they're taking the exact same language and criminalizing it, perhaps sometimes with a state of mind and knowing requirement. And the question is whether the same words ought to get the same interpretation, and whether the criminal interpretation, accounting for rule of lenity, notice, and other principles, ought to dominate. And I think you're going to see more lawyers, more parties paying attention to that. Now, if you go down still another level and focus on really the topic you're going to start out with today, rulemaking, interpretive rules, and the like, you see just a couple good examples of, I guess I would say, pretty serious differences between the federal and state models, areas where perhaps the state models might be instructive for what the federal model ought to look like going forward. So at the federal level, at OIRA, we know they can review significant regulatory actions before an agency promulgates them, but it's not based on any statute, and OIRA can't formally veto anything. Well, at the state level, they're not necessarily called OIRAs. I mean, it could be, a gubernatorial form of review on its own, but many states provide for not only OIRA review, but states like Arizona, California, Hawaii, Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, Wisconsin provide permission to review the rule and reject the rule. Some states, Iowa, Missouri, and Louisiana, permit a governor to rescind a rule through a similar process, but after the fact. So theoretically, a later governor, potentially of a different party, could then rescind the rule through this process. Some states give their legislatures a role to play in the regulatory review process. For example, Kentucky allows its governor to approve or disapprove a rule if a legislative committee finds the rule deficient. Maryland lets its governor reject or instruct an agency to modify rules if a legislative review committee votes to oppose them. You might be interested to know that in Florida, former Governor Rick Scott tried to create a centralized regulatory review process like the federal model. So he's trying to create an OIRA model, but the Florida Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional and unauthorized by statute at the state level. Some states also incorporate, I guess I'll call them more exotic requirements into their agency review process. In Arizona, for example, an agency promulgating a rule that turns on scientific principles or methods must in turn show that the science comports with a Daubert-like inquiry to test it. Some still more states, I think California and Oregon fit in this category, require notice and comment for significant interpretive rules. So that would obviously implicate the Chevron debate. When it comes to state arbitrary and capricious review, you again have a bit of a contrast. At the federal level, you're looking at a record, the facts, but you're also looking at the reasoning that the agency supplies. And even if arbitrary and capricious review is a pretty modest form of review, it still actually looks at the reasoning that the agency uses. That's not the case in some states. So for example, in Washington state, they reject that reasoning requirement, and you really would call it a form of rational basis review. They're simply looking at whether the record underlying the rule would permit the conclusion that this was reasonable. So they're not actually examining what the agency did in terms of reasoning. They're examining only the record before it and deciding whether a reasonable agency could do this type of thing. Wisconsin does something almost identical as well. So I'm at about 15 minutes, and I guess the way I'd put it is the long of and the short of it is that these state differences sometimes turn on constitutional level rules, plural executive, express separation of powers clauses, and other times simply turn on the Brandeisian value of experimentation at the state level. And I'd simply close by saying, if you've got 50 labs out there, not a bad idea for ACUS to be looking at them. You're going to be hearing a lot from the court in this area, the US Supreme Court that is, and not a bad idea to be ahead of the curve and ready to adjust if they require it. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you all. Kudos to you for thinking about state administrative law, and anytime I can be helpful in the future, please let me know. And Kate, thank you for inviting me, and Andy, thank you for starting us off.
Thank you, Judge Sutton, for your thoughtful insights and your ongoing work in this area. We really appreciate your time. I want to just take a moment in the transition to the panel discussion that's coming up next to say a few more words about the Roundtable project. As Andy mentioned, today's symposium is really just the start of what Maria and I, as well as the staff at ACUS, envision to be an ongoing conversation about innovations at state and local level in administrative procedure. And some of those things may have direct applicability to what the federal agencies are doing. Some may not, based on some of the comparisons and differences that the Chief Judge just mentioned. But they also may just teach important lessons learned or spark new ideas for improvements at the federal level. Over the coming year, again, as Andy mentioned, this conversation will take the form of future additional symposium programming. We'll bring together those on the front lines of state and local administrative procedure, including advocates, stakeholders, the public servants involved, as well as academics focused on this particular area. We'll take a deeper dive into particular areas of innovation and look at specific programs underway. I want to put a plug in here to, that we really welcome the ideas of the broad ACUS community and those involved in state and local administrative procedure to bring us your ideas for future discussion and any ideas you have for how to facilitate a fruitful collaboration among those who are looking at ways to improve administrative procedure for everyone involved, both at the federal and frankly at the state level too. So with that, I'll turn it over to Maria.
Thanks, Kate. So first, I just want to start out by thanking ACUS and in particular Jeremy and Alexandra for all of the work that they've done in bringing this together. I'm delighted to be working with Kate to co-chair this roundtable. So we are going to take things from the general and really dig into the nitty-gritty. So internally, we've been describing this first panel as a teaser of sorts. The idea is basically to give everyone a sense of what states might be doing that the federal government could potentially learn from, what areas of collaboration might be, and really hopefully to underscore what Kate just said, to spark ideas of what the folks in this room and in the broader ACUS community might want to learn more about. And the topic that we identified is state data and transparency practices. We focused on data and transparency in part because it felt like one area where state and local governments almost by necessity are pushed to innovate in ways that they interact with regulated entities, interact with the broader public, share their data information in ways that can really facilitate more collaborative and inclusive governance. And so with me here today, I have first Reeve Bull, who obviously needs no introduction to the ACUS community. He was research director at ACUS, and now very fortuitously for us is the deputy director at the Office of Regulatory Management in Virginia, which is basically kind of Virginia's version of OIRA. And then the second panelist is Neil Kleiman. He's a public policy professor at Northeastern University, who has done a lot of terrific work around data and transparency practices at the local level. And we'll talk about some of those today. So Reeve, I'm going to start with you. And given your somewhat fortuitous dual role, if you will, you were at ACUS when we first started to discuss this project. Now you're in Virginia state government. And I'm curious, now that you've kind of had a chance to dip into state administrative practice and procedure, what do you think of this project? Like, does it still seem worth it, or do you see it in a different light? What's jumped out at you as kind of possible areas of focus or interest?
Wonderful. So first of all, thanks, Maria, for that wonderful introduction. And it's great to be back here at ACUS. And I have to say also, that I've always been a huge fan of the project, both at my time at ACUS, and I think maybe even more so now that I'm in state government. And I was delighted at the time that both you, Maria, and Kate were able to lead this project. I can't think of two people better positioned to take the lead on this. And I think given your leadership, it's not at all a surprise that this is off to such an auspicious start. So with that sort of, I think, both Chief Judge Sutton and Chairman Foyce mentioned the Brandeis, Laboratories of Democracy analogy, and I'm a strong believer in that, and I think that that'll be really one of the major benefits of this project is allowing federal agencies to learn from these innovations that are taking place at the state level. But I should also say that sort of one thing that I've learned is sort of one of the things that's really been driven home to me in the last few months. Since starting this position, it's the two-way street. The state agencies are also learning from their federal counterparts, and a lot of what you see at the state level is in large measure based on federal practice, to some extent or another. But one thing that has really been driven home as I've been in this position is that state agencies oftentimes don't have as extensive of resources as the federal governments do, or the federal government does. The states are necessarily much smaller. And that has its own challenges, but I think in some ways it can actually be a good thing, in that I think it's actually innovation forcing in some respects. So one thing that we've seen, one thing we've done is tried to put in place a cost benefit analysis framework at the state level. And, unlike federal agencies, Virginia state agencies don't have an economist on staff. So we've really had to sort of streamline it. And I think actually what we've done is somewhat innovative and could, potentially have some implications at the federal level. And then I think two of the things, or several of the things that we'll be discussing today, I think are sort of in a similar boat with respect to transparency, that a lot of what we did when, Director Wheeler and I started up this office was look at what the federal government is doing and decide, can we replicate that at the state level? In most cases, the answer was yes. But it had to be modified in certain respects in order to make it more, attuned and streamlined to what would be feasible in the state of Virginia. And I imagine that a lot of states, local governments as well, are in a similar boat where they're sort of looking at federal practice, looking at other state practices, but innovating and modifying it in a way that works, given the resources that they have and sort of the goals that they're trying to accomplish. So that I think is sort of one of the major lessons that I've seen, working at the state level so far, and I hope will be one of the real benefits of this program is that you have these 50 different experiments. And I think, some of what the states are doing is innovative and could actually be adapted and considered at the federal level and considered by other states and local governments too.
Well, I will say, I'm sure a phrase like streamlined and lighter touch would be music to the ears of a lot of agency folks who may or may not be on this call. So let's talk about data and transparency. So, we talked in advance and you mentioned a couple of things that you guys have really started to spearhead in Virginia to kind of make regulations more accessible to the public and regulated entities in various ways. So talk a little about what you guys have been up to.
Absolutely. So there were at least a couple of things I'd like to highlight initially, and then there's a third one that hopefully, time permitting, we might be able to get to later in the discussion. So the two that I'd like to highlight, and they both, fall under this rubric that I mentioned at the outset, are things that we looked at the federal level and considered how we could potentially streamline them or sort of rework them in a way that would work for Virginia. And I should emphasize, at the outset that, when Governor Youngkin came into office, that there's a real focus on both streamlining and improving the regulatory process, but transparency was really right at the forefront in terms of the goals that the governor was trying to accomplish. So when he issued his Executive Order 19, which created our office, the Office of Regulatory Management, and made some reforms to the process, transparency was really critical, in terms of what the governor's trying to achieve. And I think it's critical both from a good government perspective, but I think also to ensure that the regulations are as sophisticated as possible, and that the citizens are aware of what their government is doing and that they have an opportunity to participate in the process. And so two of the things that we saw that we thought were necessary in order to achieve that transparency were first to have an equivalent basically of the federal unified agenda. So in the unified agenda, which has existed, I think, for decades. Each agency is required to forecast the regulations that they anticipate issuing over the next, year, next period of time for each agenda entry. There was basically no equivalent of that at the Virginia level. But we think it's critically important because another thing that I've seen at the state level is that the stakeholders are very actively involved. And so it's critical for them to know, a year out, what the Virginia agencies are considering so that they have that opportunity to provide input, to work with the agencies, to make their concerns known, to offer regulatory alternatives. So we basically did our first iteration of this last year. The first, we call it the Unified Regulatory Plan, was issued in fall of last year. And it was something like 300 regulations and 300 guidance documents, because we include guidance documents as well, that Virginia agencies were issuing over the state fiscal year, which runs until July 1st of this year. It's a somewhat different fiscal year, but basically those were the number of regulations and guidance documents that were being issued over that period of time. So we compiled this, we put it up on our website, our town hall website, and then we also broke it down by agency. And I think that this has really kind of been a game changer in the sense that both stakeholders in Virginia now have a sense a year out of what will be coming, and then other Virginia agencies as well. I've actually several times heard from other agencies that, work very closely with their agency counterparts, and having a single source now to go to and find all of the projected regulatory actions has been very, very valuable, very beneficial. So that's the first initiative. Sorry, Maria.
For a moment, while we're talking about the first one, so you said something that caught my attention, which is that you guys included guidance documents. So I take it, I don't think that happens at the federal level. And so I'm curious the thinking behind it. And then 300 feels like a small number for volume of guidance. And so I'm wondering, how did you think about, what sorts of guidance documents get included? Is it kind of every piece of paper that the agency issues that has some kind of policy implications, or did you cabinet in some sort of meaningful way?
Yeah, so both fantastic questions. So the reason why we decided to include it is because from our perspective, the guidance is very, very important. It's the regulations, are obviously the only thing that can set requirements. But in Virginia, and I would say at the federal level too, from my experience, oftentimes stakeholders are really relying very closely on the guidance at least as much as they're relying on the regulations, because it oftentimes, really lays out in detail, here's how you actually go about complying with this regulatory requirement, some of which are often quite abstract. The guidance really lays out, how a regulated party can achieve compliance. So we thought it was important for that reason that the guidance be included. And, obviously, and you mentioned the volume, and when I was at ACUS, I forget which recommendation it was, but, we found that there were potentially millions, of guidance documents at the federal level. It's an enormous number. So it may not necessarily be practical, at the federal level to have some equivalent. I mean, I think where we came down in the ACUS recommendation was agencies should put up on their websites, their guidance documents and, try to catalog them. But I think it's something that's really, really important, for the regulated community, particularly to be able to find these documents, because, otherwise you can't achieve compliance, if you don't know what the guidance is. In terms of the volume, so you're right that, the number is much smaller. I mean, I think part of that is because it's only new guidance documents that they're issuing. So it's probably more like, my guess would be several thousand guidance documents that are the total universe of guidance documents that Virginia agencies issue. Even that, I think is probably much smaller than what you have at the federal level. But it's a little bit more manageable for that reason. So all of our guidance documents are actually listed on the town hall website, and then it's the new guidance documents that are listed in the Unified Regulatory Plan. And we found that it's worked well from a Virginia perspective, at least. But whether or not that can translate to the federal level, I think would probably depend on each agency. But I think there's enormous value in having the guidance be publicly available and transparent, because it is such a critical component of how regulated parties particularly achieve compliance.
Perfect. So I think you were going to mention a second initiative that's kind of in that same vein.
Absolutely, yeah. So the other initiative that we undertook, again, partly inspired by federal practice, was that, and for this, I'll need to give some background, Virginia specific background. So our APA, which in Virginia stands for Administrative Process Act rather than Administrative Procedure Act, requires that agencies go through a set of steps that's similar to what you see at the federal level. But our APA actually exempts a significant number of regulatory actions from the APA process. The first several articles of our APA lay out certain agencies, entire agencies that are exempt from the traditional process. And then also lays out specific actions that are exempt. And there's perhaps a policy, reason for doing that. But one thing that we thought, and the governor really, emphasized this, is that there's really no good reason why, even if these actions are exempt, they shouldn't be available online. At the very least, they should be available. People should be able to find them. They should be able to go to our town hall website and identify any regulation. Now, whether they go through notice and comment and everything else involved with the APA is a separate issue, but at the very least, they should be up on the website where everybody can see. So that was something the governor specifically put in his Executive Order 19, and that was really one of the first initiatives that our office undertook when we were getting started back in June and July of last year, is working with the Virginia agencies to get all of the actions, including the exempt actions, up on the town hall website. And we've now done that. Basically, every single regulatory action is up on Town Hall. If stakeholders are interested, they can go and find it. And we think that this has been huge in terms of really promoting a level of transparency that we think is the bare minimum in order to ensure that stakeholders can be involved. I should also mention that as part of that, we also put our guidance documents up on Town Hall, and the guidance documents actually go through a review process as well. So those are now also all available, the public can see. And our guidance documents also are required to go through a comment process. So having it all available on the website, we think is critical in terms of ensuring that stakeholders can meaningfully participate in the process. And that's one of the first things that we did and we've now achieved, and I think is really making a big difference.
That's terrific. I have a question from Professor Michael Asimo, who I think is, speaks to what you were talking about earlier with guidance documents being part of the unified regulatory agenda. And his question, which was on my mind as well, is what do you do when agencies need to issue kind of unanticipated guidance, right? So, you know, major regulations, you can usually plan a year in advance, so there'll be emergency regs, but, you know, guidance feels like something that's much more prompted by questions as they come up. And so curious how the administration thinks about kind of guidance that's issued that wasn't in the anticipated kind of unified agenda, and, you know, is it a good faith test, or kind of how that's all approached?
Yeah, so it's a fantastic question. So yeah, the way we approach that, as well as unanticipated regulations too, because occasionally we see some of those. I think you're exactly right, Maria. The vast majority of the regulations you can plan in advance, whereas guidance often does need to change at a moment's notice. So what we've done is basically, if that happens, and it has happened with some degree of frequency, the agencies will come to us and we can approve pretty much same day. If they request, you know, would like to issue this new guidance document, we go ahead and in pretty much all cases, you know, allow them to go ahead and put it in the plan. Now, we often look at the guidance documents and the regulations when we get them, and with the guidance documents particularly, we look at them very closely and decide, do you need a guidance document here? Is it appropriate for a guidance document? You know, oftentimes, you'll see things that sort of get pretty close to being a regulatory requirement that's in a guidance document. So we'll work with the agencies and decide, is this actually better in a regulation as opposed to a guidance document? But it's a very streamlined process. Frankly, I think a much more streamlined process than what existed before. I mean, this is maybe only tangentially relevant, but to sort of how our offices work a little bit. So the review process before our office was created would take something like 250 days, I believe was the average between when a regulation was submitted for review and when it actually got approved. I believe our average is now down to 12 days for all regulations. And for guidance documents, it's even shorter still. I think it's 9 days from when it's submitted to when the agency gets an answer. And in most cases, we do approve it, but in some cases, we go back and, you know, work with the agency. But in terms of getting an answer to the agency, it's 12 days for regulations and 9 days for guidance documents, which is way faster, you know, than it used to be.
Well, that sounds like something that another follow-up panel could definitely dig into. So I want to bring in Neil, who writes about local government law. And, you know, as Neil and I were talking, what struck me is, you know, Reeve, you and I kind of, you know, wonky admin nerds, if you will. And a lot of the things that were on my mind were very, you know, posting agency guidance, regulations, that sort of classic admin law type of transparency. But a lot of the stuff that happens at the local level and the sort of things that Neil works on are much more granular, much more, I think, innovative and accessible forms of transparency that are really kind of taking things to a new level and thinking about how agencies use data and communicate information, go well beyond these sorts of you know, traditional admin law norms. I think lots of the folks here probably are familiar with the concept of the kind of smart cities phenomenon, which is, you know, one kind of umbrella term for this. But Neil, you know, you recently published a book, New City operating system that talks a little bit about this. So tell us a little about, what cities are doing with data in ways that kind of facilitate, better governance, more collaborative governance in various ways.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And, one of the reasons I love working with cities, and I work with them in so many different ways. I provide direct TA to cities. I do research and write books about cities, but I'm also the only person I know that currently has grant-funded projects with the 3 local professional organizations with cities, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities, and ICMA, the International City County Management Association. And I just am continuously learning from them because they're so innovative with data in all kinds of new ways and variety of ways. And I think that's because they have extreme pressures that I hear about all the time that the federal government and state governments don't have. And one of those is monetary pressures, because they are required to do a lot of things by law and by policy at the national and the subnational level. So they have to get it done. And usually they have to get it done at a much cheaper rate and for less money than is allocated to them. And they're also under the pressure of actual human beings, the residents and the citizens that hold them accountable, not only at the ballot box, but at the grocery store, because they are the ones that are implementing the program. So in a sense, they're more like managers of a company that are then implementing and operationalizing the policies that happen at that, typically at the national or at the state level. And so there's been all kinds of innovative ways that they've been using data that are both more transparent, but also helping them internally become more efficient with service delivery systems that in turn are becoming more transparent and resident friendly. So I like to think of this sometimes in a few major categories. So the first one that I'll come back to is performance management data, which is huge. Another one is, and we've been talking some about this, is open data. So you see a lot more local level laws, even city councils passing open data that's making more data available on websites and in other capacities. There's a lot of what is referred to as smart cities data. So this can be interpreted and misinterpreted in all kinds of ways, but one of the main ways I think about it is another phrase that's called the Internet of Things, where we have tiny little sensors that are located throughout cities and on streets and on sewers and pipes and roadways. And all these tiny little sensors talk to each other. And it's enabled cities to do really incredible things like predict when the next water main break will be, or if there's a pothole that's about to form into a sinkhole. And there are lots of ways that smart cities can help cities better run their own streets. And then the other type of data that I would just put out there is big data. And that's a phrase a lot of us have heard before and don't have much of a sense of, but it's essentially taking administrative data, huge amounts of administrative data from different categories, from different departments, and merging them, making sense of them, and using them in predictive ways. So one of the ways that comes out is through what's referred to as CompStat, where local police departments are merging various data sources to predict where future crime spots will be. But just going backwards for a minute, in terms of performance data, this is something that has really led to a bit of a revolution within local government. So 30, 40 years ago, most cities didn't even have a good handle of what was going on within city limits, meaning even how many city buildings there are, let alone how many potholes there are out there to be fixed. But because data has become more sophisticated and it's easier to capture, cities now use data in dashboard-like capacities where it's quite easy to just quickly look at a dashboard that articulates and reflects what the service systems look like in a particular area, whether that be sanitation, whether that be parks and rec, whether that be crime statistics. And more than using those for performance management, they're also using public dashboards where they're just throwing it up on the internet. So I don't want folks to feel distracted now, but whatever city that you're in or you commute from, or any city that you're interested in, if you type in, let's say, Chicago public dashboard, or Boston has one that I think is great called the Boston City Score, and you are able to see just in a flash what the numbers look like in any particular area based on this performance management data, and in a sense, begin to hold local governments more accountable.
Yeah, so I have a screen cap of Boston's, which you had mentioned, and I went to take a look at. It was really terrific. I am going to very quickly share my screen. You know what? I maybe cannot share my screen. Sorry about this, everybody.
That's all right. Well, and I'll just say, as maybe you're looking for it, I've had the pleasure of working with the Boston mayor, who's now running the Department of Labor at the federal level. And what he really liked about it is that it reminded him of like the Red Sox, right? Like you wake up every day in Boston and you're like, did the Red Sox win or did they lose? Just tell me that. And he said, well, as a city, are we doing a good job or are we not doing as good a job? And so on a daily basis, Boston is able to reflect out whether, again, it has to do with sanitation or crime or healthcare. Are they above a certain threshold or below a certain threshold? Now, of course, this raises all kinds of issues in terms of how useful is it to look at data scores or metrics on a daily basis. But what I like about it is it sort of inculcates this notion of accountability and using data to track where government is and that government is becoming more responsive. Now, most other cities tend to update that data on a quarterly basis, but it's led to a range of important conversations and a lot more engagement with communities. So now when communities want to do things like convert vacant parking lots into playgrounds or other uses, and I've talked to these community groups, they're able to pull in this various data that governments are making more accessible. And from a federal level, and I think that was the point of this whole conversation, there is so much to learn because a lot of these experiments haven't worked well. They've raised ethical issues, they've raised technical issues, they've led to more work for some departments that already feel overworked. So I'm not trying to paint a picture that's entirely sanguine. But I am trying to say that there is a real sea change that's happening at the local level in terms of a range of different experiments with data. And a lot of them are working. And because citizens are seeing the value of them, I'm here to say they're not going backwards. If anything, we're seeing more and more of this experimentation, more and more transparency and openness. And some of it is that a lot of civic hackers and those that are active around data issues within communities are making use of the data anyway. Local government wants to get ahead of the curve. So there's just a tremendous amount that the folks at the federal level could learn from these experiments. And what I'm hoping we'll get a chance to talk about is that if at the federal level we focus on more of these sub-national level experiments, there are ways that we can help to make sense of them, support them, make them more routine, and at times begin to intervene when they might be moving in directions that are questionable, right? And so one of the most salient examples of this is the stop and frisk policy, which was very much motivated by data and performance management and had a lot of questionable outcomes. And so I think if there's more relationship between the federal and subnational level, I think it can help us. Oh, so here we see City Score. And as you can see, if it's okay to go to the next screen of this, it's so nicely designed. Actually, was there a screen prior to that one? Yeah, here it is. So if you see here, basically 1 is a baseline. And if the score is above 1, it means that in that particular category or for that metric, the city is performing above the baseline projected goal. If it's below 1, it means that it's performing a bit under. So again, you can see just at a glance, within seconds, any citizen is able to hop on the website and see, is the on-time pothole filling doing well or less well than local government is projected for these various metrics.
So I was saying, I can imagine any number of possible use. I mean, some of the things I'm looking at are, on-time permit reviews. I know that's, always a concern at both the federal and state level. I'm curious if you have an instinct on how much this is actually informing kind of local, both political oversight and actual governance. So, you know, I can't help but notice like graffiti is not doing great and has not been doing great for the past quarter. And, you know, how are city officials kind of using these, you know, quick metrics to try to get at that?
It's been a complete revolution. I cannot emphasize that enough. So like just even talking about sort of on-time rates for permits, right? What this has led is to the, you know, the permitting or the buildings agency or the business agencies that are responsible for those areas to be in a point of crisis about the metrics, how they're being used, how they're now being bombarded by citizens, by the media, by others. And to me, it's led to healthy conversations, so that what those agencies then do is go back to the mayor or go back to city council and argue to change the metrics, in a sense saying, you know what, you're holding us accountable for this metric, it's not the right one. What you should hold us accountable for are the types of permits, meaning a large number of permits could be now done automatically. We're talking about AI, we have machine learning, and some cities are starting to use more machine learning tools to automatically fill those permits that are easier to expedite. So it's that old 80-20 rule where it's really just 20% of the cases that are taking up 80% of the time, and it's forcing legitimate and needed conversations around performance, operational organization that before were just internal within the agencies. So I think by having these kinds of metrics out there, it's providing the accountability and the types of conversations that we need across departments, across agencies, with citizens, between the executive and the legislative branch.
So this seems terrific. And as a, you know, I'm not a Boston resident, but if I had this sort of thing in Austin, I can imagine any number of ways in which it would be informative. But it also seems like a lot of work. Or is it, I'm curious what it takes, not just to get something like this off the ground, that's a design issue, but just that kind of day-to-day maintenance of feeding this sort of information. And do you have a sense of kind of how Boston or other cities are tackling it to reduce the kind of burden on agencies to produce it?
So the work is not so much in the data collection, it's really in the initial system design. So there are already staff that produce these numbers, and so it's a matter of then feeding it into this type of platform and format. So really, I think the work comes more centrally at the higher levels in terms of designing the platform, and there isn't sort of a call for additional data sets or administrative data to be collected that hasn't been collected prior to the exercise or the platform construction. It's really based on existing administrative data within the agency. Now, of course, some of this leads to really important conversations when such platforms are created, that certain administrative data isn't collected that could be collected. And then again, I think that leads to healthy conversations about what are the resources that are needed to collect such administrative data. But at the moment, and I would argue the same exists at the federal level, the issue is not staffing data or developing data. We have a lot of data already. We're awash in data. It's a matter of how we organize it and for what reasons and how we protect it. Both how do we ingest the data, how do we present the data, and how do we evaluate the data that we are producing.
This is really terrific. Reeve, I want to bring you in. I'm curious, first of all, just if anything from what Neil's been talking about kind of resonated, or if, you know, any kind of immediate state level uses jump out, because this, you know, it has really been a very much a city phenomenon. You know, every city has a dashboard, a lot fewer dashboards at the state level. I will say I looked for a while to see if I could find a great parallel example, and they were a little harder to come by. So first, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to chime in, and then, but yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. So first of all, you know, I loved this presentation. I mean, this is really cool. This is really, really interesting. And I think you're definitely right, Maria, that there are probably fewer dashboards that I'm aware of, at least, you know, in Virginia. But I did want to sort of highlight one thing that we've done that I think is quite innovative and very much sort of in line with what Neil is talking about. So we're the Office of Regulatory Management. We also have what we call our Transformation Office that's led by a former McKinsey partner, Eric Miller. So when and their office is new as well. And so they've looked at sort of ways, particularly that they can use data and new processes to really improve how the state government operates. And so they focused on two agencies, one of which is the DMV, which, you know, I'm sure resonates probably with everybody on the call as sort of the poster child for government that people are not so impressed with, you know, don't generally like interacting with. And we were having a major problem at our DMVs in Virginia where the wait times were terrible. I think something like between 1 and 2 hours or thereabouts with respect to, you know, how long it takes to actually get your transaction processed and get through the process. So our transformation team went in, they really looked at the data at the different Virginia DMVs. And they were able, by crunching those numbers, actually to identify what the problem was, which in this particular case, I think was a surge capacity issue where the staffing wasn't quite right. Essentially, they didn't have enough people at many of the offices, or they didn't have them there at the right times. So by actually just readjusting things, not hiring more people or really changing anything other than just sort of responding to the surge capacity, they were able to get the wait time down to, I think, something like 10 minutes or thereabouts, which you know, I'm sure, at least from my experience, is way faster than, you know, my experience has ever been in the past. So it's a real success story. You know, I think it was an area where we were really able to use data, use these types of processes, identify a problem, identify a solution without really pouring a whole lot of additional resources into it.
I will say, as a resident of Texas, I would love to see that happen here. You know, a lot of what Neil's been talking about and what you, I think, were just highlighting with the DMV example is the use of kind of data and transparency as a performance management tool. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about the third project that you mentioned around permitting and the kind of new permit tracking system that you've started up. And Jeremy, this is the next slide to the extent folks want to take a look at what this looks like in practice. But first, let's say, what is this and what are you doing with it?
Absolutely. So yeah, so this is maybe one of the examples that we have of a dashboard that we have actually created. And it's an initiative that actually started at our Department of Environmental Quality, which is basically our EPA. So the DEQ issues a pretty significant number of permits every year, I think on the order of 10,000 or thereabouts, or in the tens of thousands of permits. And those permits are spread across different components within DEQ. There's a water permitting component, an air permitting component, and various other permits, projects that are within DEQ. What DEQ did is, starting in the water permitting area, they decided to create this new dashboard. And I think it's very much in line with sort of the type of initiative that Neil is talking about. And the idea was basically really just to get all of the information online. So within this water program, I think there are something like several hundred permits per year that are issued. And so DEQ created this database, which we call the Permitting Evaluation Enhancement Platform, or PEEPS. What it does is it basically lays out every program, every type of permit within the water department at DEQ. And then for each of those programs, every single permit that somebody would apply for is up on this website. And so what you're seeing here on the screen is what it would look like if you click on one of those permits within a program. And you can see that it's basically like a series of Gantt charts. It lays out the different steps of the permitting process, and then it has a target timeline. And in this case, those are the gray bars that you see. That's how long each entity has to review the permit, and in some cases you can see they're overlapping. And then the other bars that you see show how long it actually took. So right there on the website whether the relevant players are meeting their deadlines or not. And so this is just basically one permit within one agency. And what we're doing now is we're taking this very innovative practice at DEQ, and we're rolling it out first to DEQ more generally, so that all of the different permits that DEQ deals with will be up on the PEEPS platform. And then ultimately, and this is longer term, probably the next year or thereabouts, we'll be taking all of the other permits in state government and putting them up on the same website. So like our transportation department, our energy department, the Marine Resources Agency, all of them will participate in this PEEPS system. The challenge, of course, has been trying to figure out sort of a common set of rubrics, for the various permits, and that's what we're currently working on, trying to bring everything into a unified database. But when it's done, basically every single permit in the state of Virginia, if you're applying for a permit or if you're interested in commenting on a permit, you can go to this single website and find it here. One thing I'll sort of emphasize and sort of really say that I think is one of the real benefits of this is that it really sets the right incentives. So Neil was alluded to that, as part of his presentation. I think a real benefit is now that this is all online, now that this is transparent, if there is a delay, and there often is, when it comes to permitting, you can now see precisely where that delay is, where in the process it is. And one of the interesting things that we found, and actually this specific slide illustrates that, is sometimes the delay is not on the agency's end. Actually, sometimes the delay is the applicant is just taking an unusually long amount of time to respond to the agency. So in this case, you can see the orange bar is actually for the applicant, and that's where the delay is. The agency actually processed it in a reasonably timely manner. So we think this keeps everybody honest. If the problem is at the agency, you can see exactly where it is. And it provides a real incentive for both the agency itself and then individual people within the agency to get things done in a more timely way. But if the problem is actually on the applicant's end, then you can see that as well. So we think this makes it better for everybody, much more transparent, and should ideally, as this is fully rolled out, really expedite the permitting process here in Virginia.
I will say, so I think this is just particularly cool. And what struck me as you were telling me about this initially, the very first permit I clicked on had these big orange bars, just like this one. And it really drove home that, you hear stories about it's a 2-year permitting process. It's this permit looks like it's about 9 months delayed with the kind of revised dates, but then you look and actually, at least in this particular case, this one's really not so much on the agency as on the applicant. I'm curious, as you've started to, talk with other agencies about this rollout, first, how time intensive is this for the agencies to implement? Like, what does it take and how much is it kind of, day-to-day management, and how much of it is, as Neil was saying, that kind of initial system design, and then it's kind of pulling data more or less automatically at that point?
Yeah, so I think for at least from what we've seen so far, the vast majority of the time is going to be on the front end, on the actual process of designing it. And I think that's because each permit is a little bit different. They have common features, but the agencies, will use different terminology frequently. So trying to standardize it is proven to be a little bit of a challenge. So I think we're making fantastic progress, and we'll get there. Once that's done, though, I think, and Neil had mentioned this as well, the data already exists. And so I think actually putting it up on this website, if anything, should actually save the agency's time, because they're all tracking this information anyway. What we found is in some cases, they're actually still tracking it by paper, which is a little shocking, and then also very slow, very problematic. So making this system available to the agencies, I think will actually ultimately make their job easier. So there will be a little bit of some investment on the front end in terms of trying to get everything into this common system. But I think on the back end, it won't take any longer. And if anything, it'll probably be a little faster and a little easier on their end. One other thing I should also mention, so this is the public facing aspect of PEEPS. What it also has is an internal system that isn't public. And that actually is a management tool. And that's that if there is a delay at a particular stage of the process, the individual, the agency official who is responsible for that delay, that won't go up on the public website, but that individual supervisor, after a certain number of days, will receive an email automatically. And then if it gets delayed further, then that person's supervisor will receive an email, and so on and so forth until it gets all the way up to the head of the agency after about 2 months or thereabouts. So that too, we think really will provide the proper incentives, but then also will really speed things up and should be a useful management tool because this will all be auto-generated. It's actually the system itself that's sending out these emails. So we think it'll actually make things a lot easier for the agencies, especially the supervisors, the management within the agency, to track workflows and to make sure everything is moving along in a timely way.
Well, this is terrific and good luck with the expansion. So I want to bring Neil in, Neil, to just give you an opportunity to talk about another big project that I take it has taken up a decent chunk of your life in recent years. This is the City Health Dashboard. And I wanted to highlight it just in part because I think it highlights one other dimension of this roundtable that maybe I hadn't focused on, Neil, before talking with you. And that's the fact that, state and local government, state and local agencies are consumers of federal programs. They implement federal programs. There's a lot of kind of local, state, federal collaboration happening. And I think one of the things we also could potentially spotlight as part of this roundtable are, ways that the federal government can both, facilitate information sharing among different agencies that are implementing various federal programs, help local decision makers do their work better by, really driving their data down. And the City Health Dashboard, as you mentioned, it's not a federal project, but very easily could have been and is, I think, potentially a model for the sorts of things that federal agencies could be thinking about. So tell us just a little bit about this project to start.
Yeah, so this actually is a project that grew out of a federal program called the National Resource Network. And it was something that was set up by the Obama administration after that administration went to Detroit to be helpful after Detroit slipped into bankruptcy. And based on that experience, the White House set aside $10 million for a number of different organizations and institutions. And at the time I was at New York University and we were one of them, to help 50 cities that were economically distressed, that were really on the precipice of going bankrupt. And so we spent a lot of time evaluating those cities and seeing where they needed help. And we imagined everything that cities would want help on would be like fiscal health, balancing their books. And we were really surprised and kind of upset to find that a lot of what cities wanted was health data. And you might say, why health data? Because this happened during the Obama years, pre-pandemic. And that's because cities are dealing with a lot of issues that they don't understand at the local level, whether it's the opioid epidemic, whether it's an obesity crisis, whether it's crime that is a public health issue, all sorts of things where you have data and information that is exclusively collected at the county or the state level or the federal level and not collected at the municipal level because of various census and ACUS tracks and boundaries. And we found these municipal leaders wanted to begin to tackle these issues and work in partnership with their county governments, but it was something that was very difficult to do because they did not have a sense of the information that existed. So what we've done, which has never been done in the country before, is we raised about $10 million from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to essentially extend data downwards from either the federal, state, or county level to the municipal level for 40 measures of health and public health in over 900 cities. And if you go to the next slide, This is an example of if you go to the dashboard, and anybody's welcome to go to it after this webinar. It's just cityhealthdashboard.com, and you can choose a city. So here I noticed, Maria, you chose Austin, which is nice. And you can see that you can very easily tell in a dashboard-like fashion how Austin is doing on these various measures of health. And what we found cities find particularly helpful is to find peer cities. So Austin may want to compare itself to other capital cities, possibly, like Boston in Massachusetts or Denver in Colorado, or it may want to compare itself to other mid-sized cities within the state of Texas. So that could be Fort Worth or Waco, let's say, and see what these various measures of health are telling them. And we have been working with dozens and dozens of cities every year that are using exactly this. We created a COVID index to address COVID issues, obesity, opioids, all kinds of different issues that come up. And although we raised a good amount of money, $10 million, and we have a whole data analytic team that helps to take the data and engage in very precise estimates of census tract and other information in terms of how the federal government is collecting this data, it wasn't impossible, right? It's not too difficult. And you could imagine at the federal level or at the state level, if there was more dedication to having such data that's available, it makes it infinitely easier for those local level administrators that want to use this information to better address and reform programs and policies within their midst. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, so this is terrific. I want to, Jeremy, if you want to move to the next slide, just highlight, I initially thought this was kind of just a city level dashboard, but now get the sense that this is actually also empowering cities to kind of look internally within themselves. So talk a little bit about what we're looking at here.
So when we're not able to do this with all of the data sets, but here, if you look at life expectancy, which is a pretty good proxy measure for certainly public health and health, then you can very quickly see sort of a crisis within city limits in terms of a combination of different factors. So to have a difference of 20 years of life expectancy within municipal boundaries of Columbus, Ohio is striking. And actually, we worked a lot with Time Magazine that did a piece on this about a year ago when we came out with this life expectancy measure by zip code. And it's something that can be catalytic in terms of motivating different local level departments. The other thing that I would say is really helpful when you have data like this that can work within city limits is that it really engenders a cross department conversation. And so that's one of the things that we've been doing, because we've been engaging in sort of almost like what you might think of as policy coaching, where a lot of local governments are saying, okay, now we have this data, it's quite striking and our citizens are able to access it. What do we do with that? And so what we have really focused on is how to bring different department heads and administrators together across agencies to see how they begin to address this issue. Because obviously, if you're looking at something like life expectancy, you can't just have this relegated to primary care physicians or hospitals or locations. There are a number of other service delivery systems, whether that be education or criminal justice or shelter and housing that come into play. And I think that's what we're finding the data can be very powerful in doing. I also have had, at the federal level, seen that there are a lot of opportunities when you become more transparent with data to encourage more of these cross-departmental conversations that happen.
Well, I'd love to ask you more about that. I also just want to invite anybody who's attending the webinar, if you want to post any questions you have in the chat, I will gladly incorporate those. But while we're waiting to see if folks have questions, I'm curious, how have cities been making use of this? If there are particular cities that you've been working with that really seem to have kind of leveraged this either in unexpected or just kind of particularly intensive ways?
Well, with the dashboard in particular, what has been most helpful is for cities to better engage with their counties. It's really remarkable, like what a divide there is in terms of collaboration or policy conversations or data sharing that happens within sort of various levels of government. I mean, I think this is just one of the things that we're all aware of in the US, that we have a federalist system, which in a way is beautiful because we have all these laboratories of democracy, but it really hasn't led to much intergovernmental cooperation, data sharing, or policy and program reform efforts. And so what this has done, which has just been very heartening to us, has enabled municipal governments to approach their county governments and say, not only do we want to have the conversation, but we actually have the data to have this conversation with you about what is happening and how we can be a better actor in terms of the service systems that we're responsible for. And so that's one of the things that we really think data has the power to do, which is to encourage more intergovernmental cooperation and analysis. I mean, there was a lot more of this when we had the AIG. I might forget exactly what it stands for, but there was basically a federal commission that was the in charge of intergovernmental relations that was disbanded during the Clinton administration, and since that period there's been virtually no sort of active or intentional analysis of how data is collected and assessed and utilized within the different levels of government. And so that's the part of it that we've been most excited about, is when localities can use this to have the conversations that they need to have with different levels. And again, I think at the federal level, it plays out in a similar way, where I think at the federal level, there's a lot to be learned by the experimentation at the local level, but hopefully there's the desire that if local levels of government have more of an understanding and transparency of the federal data that's collected, it could lead to intergovernmental conversation and discussion about those policies and programs that don't even have to get anywhere near the legislative or polarizing debates that we currently see.
I mean, among the many, possible use cases, as I was kind of listening to talk, are, all the ways in which, as I mentioned, local agencies will often implement federal programs. And I'm guessing, a lot of this data should in theory be in federal hands in terms of, processing times for benefit applications, or how standards and implementation have differed. And it strikes me that this is one area where actually making that data much more accessible to facilitate comparison, figure out there's a difference between Memphis and Nashville, why, what's going on, how do we think about it, both to kind of make local officials aware of what's happening, but also kind of facilitate the federal oversight of local implementation. So that's, among the many reasons I find all of this really exciting. So I'm not seeing questions from the panel. So I'm
well, maybe just one quick thing on that.
Yeah,
which is one of the more surprising and interesting outcomes of this are consent decrees. And as you may know, consent decrees are at the federal level, whether it comes with environmental cleanup or sort of criminal justice consent decrees, where the federal government will essentially, through the courts, take over local police departments. And we found that localities have been using this both for the criminal justice and environmental ways to have more holistic and comprehensive conversations about how those consent decrees are going, working both with federal agencies, but then also working with the court monitors on those consent decrees. And so again, data's power, right? And so when you have more of that information available, and it doesn't mean avoiding the consent decree. I don't think anyone is arguing that, but it's led to a more holistic conversation about how localities can begin to address the consent decree in a way that makes sense.
I mean, I write about policing in my not so spare time. And so I'm both very familiar with the model and can very much see the ways in which data could inform, as you say, a much more kind of holistic approach. Reeve, I just want to give you an opportunity if you have any closing thoughts before I end things, to try to do it on time.
Wonderful. Yeah, just very, very quickly. So first of all, thanks again. This has been a fantastic conversation. And one final thought that I have is, learning is obviously, a critical component of this. But I think one theme that sort of emerged here is that there are also real opportunities for partnership, both between federal governments and state and local governments as well. And I think part of that is information sharing, data sharing. But I think there are also potentially opportunities where the multiple different entities can work directly together. Like I'm thinking particularly with our permitting platform, a lot of the permitting is not at the state level. It's actually at the federal level or the local level. And we would be delighted, to have the opportunity to, bring in the Army Corps of Engineers and bring in local governments too, as part of this program. So I think that'll be an interesting theme to explore, as this project moves forward, is, how the different levels of government can learn from each other, but how they can also work cooperatively, because they're oftentimes confronting many of the same problems, and I think can really, leverage each other's strengths in a way that provides for better outcomes.
Absolutely. And that feels like a terrific note on which to end. So first, I just want to thank you both for joining us. This was a long time coming, and I'm glad this was the event with which we launched. And also just close again with a call for folks who are in the audience to write us. We're eager to hear what you want to learn about, things you might want to explore further. This is really intended to be a tool for all of you. So thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.